Somewhere inside the walls of the Tower of London in the summer of 1483, two boys were present in the world, and then, with no announcement and no recorded explanation, they were not. One of them was the King of England. Both of them were children. Neither of them was ever seen again. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hotsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
A disappearance that has never been solved, surrounded by silence that became louder with every century that passed without an answer. Tonight, we turn to one of the most enduring and haunting mysteries in English history. A case where politics, legitimacy, and power converged around two children who stood in the way of someone else's ambition. The question tonight is not only what happened to these two boys, but what their disappearance reveals about how power controls what history remembers.
In 1483, two princes of the House of York were placed inside the Tower of London, which served at the time as both a royal residence and a place of confinement. Within months they had vanished from all contemporary records. No death was announced. No burial was proclaimed. The silence was complete.
We are speaking about the princes in the Tower.
Edward V, 12 years old, the uncrowned King of England, and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, who was 9. Two children at the center of a dynastic crisis that would reshape the English throne.
Then, let us begin with the world that made their disappearance possible, the England that produced the crisis around them.
To understand what happened in 1483, you need to understand the Wars of the Roses, the series of civil wars that had torn England apart for the preceding 3 decades. The conflict was between two branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was a white rose. Both sides had legitimate claims to the English throne through descent from King Edward III. The question of which claim was superior had been disputed, bloodily, for a generation.
So the throne was not a settled institution, it was a contested prize.
Exactly. And in this world, legitimacy was everything and nothing. It was everything because blood descent was the only recognized basis for royal authority. It was nothing because the actual power to rule depended on the loyalty of armed men, and armed men followed strength. By 1461, the Yorkist King Edward IV had secured the throne. He was a capable ruler, physically imposing, politically shrewd, and broadly popular.
So the Yorkist line seemed stable under Edward IV.
It appeared so. He had 2 sons and several daughters. The succession seemed secure. But in April of 1483, Edward IV passed away suddenly. He was 40 years old. His eldest son, Edward V, was 12. A child king in 15th century England was not merely a political inconvenience. He was a structural vulnerability. Someone would have to govern in his name, and whoever held that position would effectively hold the kingdom.
So the death of the king immediately created a competition for control of the child. Who would replace him?
Exactly. And the man who moved most quickly was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's younger brother. Richard had been one of Edward IV's most loyal commanders. He had governed the north of England with considerable ability. He was respected by many and feared by others. He was named Lord Protector of England in the young king's will, the legal guardian of the realm during Edward V's minority.
So at first, Richard appeared to be exactly what the situation required. A steady hand.
That was the initial impression. But events moved quickly and in a troubling direction. Richard intercepted the young king's escort as Edward V travelled from Wales toward London for his coronation. He took control of the boy and dismissed the Woodville family members who had been accompanying him. The Woodvilles were the family of the late king's widow, Elizabeth Woodville. They had been powerful under Edward IV and stood to remain so under his son. Richard's move effectively ended their influence at a stroke.
So control of the king meant control of the kingdom, and Richard understood this immediately.
Yes, and the next step was to secure the younger prince as well. Elizabeth Woodville had taken sanctuary with her younger son Richard of Shrewsbury in Westminster Abbey. Sanctuary was a recognized legal protection in medieval England. No one could be seized from a church without serious consequences. But Richard of Gloucester persuaded the council, and eventually Elizabeth herself, to release the younger boy. Arguments were made that the young king needed his brother's companionship. Both princes were then housed in the Tower of London. The official framing was that this was a comfortable and appropriate royal residence while preparations for the coronation continued.
The Tower was presented as hospitality, not confinement.
Yes. And this ambiguity is at the heart of everything that followed. The Tower of London was genuinely used as a royal residence. Kings and queens had stayed there before coronations for centuries. but it was also a place where political prisoners were held, and where some of them did not leave alive. The princes were seen playing in the Tower Gardens in the early summer of 1483, and then gradually they were not seen at all.
But before they disappeared from public view, something decisive had already happened.
Yes, this is the turning point. In June of 1483, a declaration was made that would change everything. A petition, later formalized as an act of parliament known as Titulus Regius, declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The grounds were that Edward had allegedly been pre-contracted, meaning secretly betrothed, to another woman before his marriage to Elizabeth. If the earlier commitment was real, the later marriage was void, and all children of that marriage were illegitimate.
So, with a single legal argument, two princes went from heirs to the throne to nothing.
Exactly. The claim has never been proven. The evidence for the alleged pre-contract rested almost entirely on the testimony of Robert Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, a man with his own reasons to seek Richard's favourites. But the legal machinery was sufficient for the purpose. The coronation of Edward V was cancelled. Richard of Gloucester was invited to take the throne. On the 6th of July, 1483, he was crowned Richard III, King of England.
So Richard had gone from protector to king in less than 3 months.
Yes, and once he was king, the princes in the Tower ceased to serve any function that required them to be alive. As long as they existed, they remained a potential rallying point for anyone who wished to challenge Richard's rule. Rivals, foreign powers, disaffected nobles, all could use the boys as a pretext for rebellion. From that summer onward, no reliable contemporary source record seeing either prince. The reports thin, then stop entirely.
So the silence itself became the evidence.
Yes, and here the mystery begins in earnest. The most widely held theory, and the one that has dominated popular imagination for 5 centuries, is that Richard III ordered the deaths of both boys. The political motive is clear. The boys were a dynastic threat. Eliminating them removed the most obvious basis for rebellion against the new king. Richard had demonstrated in his seizure of power that he was capable of decisive and ruthless action when his position required it.
So, opportunity, motive, and precedent all point toward him.
They do, but the case against Richard III rests almost entirely on inference, not on documented evidence. No contemporary document from Richard's own reign explicitly states that the princes were killed, or names him as having ordered it. The most detailed early account comes from Sir Thomas More, who wrote his History of Richard III approximately 30 years after the events, drawing on sources he did not always name and in a political environment that was already hostile to Richard's memory.
So the most complete narrative account was written a generation later, under a dynasty with reasons to blacken Richard's name.
Exactly, and this is where the story becomes genuinely complex. In August of 1485, Richard III was defeated, and his life ended at the Battle of Bosworthfield. The victor was Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was, by any strict genealogical measure, weaker than those of the Yorkist princes. His legitimacy depended in part on Richard III being seen as a criminal usurper. The more monstrous Richard appeared in historical memory, the more justified Henry's conquest became. This is not coincidence. It is the logic of how dynasties write the history of their predecessors.
So the Tudor dynasty had every reason to ensure that Richard was remembered as a villain.
Yes, and they succeeded magnificently, aided by the most powerful literary voice of the age. William Shakespeare wrote his play, Richard III, in the 1590s, more than a century after the events. The Richard he depicted was a physically deformed, psychologically sadistic, gleefully villainous schemer who boasted of his own wickedness. Shakespeare drew heavily on sources shaped by Tudor interests, particularly the work of Thomas More and the chronicles of Polydore Virgil, an Italian historian working at the court of Henry VII.
So the Richard III that most people picture is a figure created by his enemies.
Yes, and here is where the alternative theories deserve careful attention. Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, is himself a credible suspect in the disappearance of the princes, or at the very least in the suppression of information about what happened to them. If the princes were still alive when Henry took power, they represented an even more direct threat to him than they had to Richard. Yorkist claimants with stronger bloodlines than Henry Tudor's had a habit of generating rebellions. Henry never made a formal inquiry into the fate of the princes. He never publicly named a suspect or charged anyone. A man who came to power partly by condemning Richard's alleged crimes chose not to investigate those crimes.
So his silence about the matter is itself suspicious.
It is one of the details that serious historians find difficult to explain. If one assumes Richard alone was responsible, another suspect sometimes proposed is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Some historians have argued that Buckingham, who had access to the Tower and a complex set of his own dynastic ambitions, may have acted against the princes independently, or on behalf of interests that remain unclear.
So there are at least 3 serious candidates, and the evidence against each is incomplete.
Yes, and there is also the possibility, which some scholars take seriously, that one or both princes survived for some time, perhaps into the Tudor period, and that the silence about them reflects ongoing concealment rather than a single act of elimination. In the 1490s, a young man named Perkin Warbeck appeared in Europe claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger prince. He attracted significant support from foreign rulers and from Yorkist exiles. Henry VII eventually captured him, and after a failed escape attempt had him executed. Whether Warbeck was a genuine prince or an impostor has never been established beyond doubt.
So even the question of whether they survived into Henry's reign is open.
Yes, and the physical evidence that has emerged over the centuries has only deepened the uncertainty. In 1674, workmen at the Tower of London discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were 2 small skeletons. King Charles II ordered the remains to be placed in an urn and interred in Westminster Abbey as the remains of the princes. The inscription on the urn attributes their disappearance directly to their uncle Richard.
So a 17th century king reached a verdict that the evidence had never formally established.
Yes. The remains were briefly examined in 1933, and the examining doctors concluded that the bones were consistent in age with the 2 princes. But the methods of 1933 were limited. No DNA analysis was performed. The sexes of the remains were not conclusively established. The dating was approximate. Requests to re-examine the remains using modern forensic techniques have been made repeatedly in recent decades. So far, the Crown has declined to authorize the examination of royal remains.
So the bones that might answer the question remain locked behind an institutional decision not to askate.
Yes, and this refusal is itself a kind of answer. Though not about what happened in 1483, it tells us something about how institutions relate to their own histories, about the discomfort that comes with reopening questions that have been given official answers, even when those answers are insecure. In 2012, the remains of Richard III himself were discovered beneath a car park in Leicester. DNA analysis confirmed the identification beyond doubt. He was reinterred with royal honours.
So modern science found the king and the princes remain where they have always been, in uncertainty.
Yes, and this asymmetry is instructive. Richard III's physical remains could be claimed and examined because there was no political cost to doing so. Examining the remains in Westminster Abbey carries a different weight entirely. If the DNA showed the remains were not the princes, it would require reopening the entire story. If it showed they were, it would still not tell us how or by whose order they came to be there.
So even the answer to the forensic question would not be the answer to the historical one.
Exactly. And this distinction is at the heart of what makes the story of the princes in the Tower so enduring. It is not simply a cold case waiting to be solved. It is a story about how power operates in the spaces where records are kept selectively, where inconvenient truths are buried alongside inconvenient people. Richard III may have ordered their deaths. Henry Tudor may have done so, or may have concealed what he knew. Buckingham may have acted independently. All of these remain possible.
So we have not one mystery but several, layered on top of each other across 5 centuries.
Yes. What the evidence does tell us with certainty is that someone had both the motive and the means to make 2 children disappear, and that the institutions surrounding that disappearance chose repeatedly and across generations to leave the question unanswered. The story of the princes in the Tower is not only about what happened to 2 children in 1483, it is about how power controls memory, and how silence maintained long enough becomes its own kind of history.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to follow this mystery further and examine the evidence for themselves, where would you invite them to begin?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Princes in the Tower by Alison Weir.
So this is a dedicated investigation into the mystery itself.
It is a detailed investigation into one of England's greatest historical mysteries, examining evidence, theories, and the enduring question of Richard III's role. Weir's meticulous with sources and honest about what can and cannot be established. She takes a position, but she shows the reader exactly how she arrived at it, and where the uncertainties lie.
Is it accessible to someone who does not already know the period?
Very much so. Weir is one of those rare historians who writes with the clarity of a narrator without sacrificing the integrity of a scholar. You do not need to know the Wars of the Roses before you begin. The book builds the context as it goes.
So reading it gives you both the evidence and the tools to aid yourself.
Precisely. And in a mystery, this old and this unresolved, that is exactly what the reader deserves.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of the prince's disappearance was felt within Richard III's own reign. By the autumn of 1483, rumours about their fate were circulating widely enough to fuel a serious rebellion against Richard, led, ironically, by the Duke of Buckingham, his own former ally. The rebellion failed, and Buckingham's life ended on the scaffold. But it demonstrated that the silence around the princes was already corrosive. People assumed the worst, and the assumption made Richard's position weaker with every passing month.
So, the disappearance that was meant to secure Richard's throne may have begun to undermine it.
Yes. Power achieved through actions that cannot be acknowledged tends to create instability rather than resolve it. After Bosworth, the Tudor dynasty moved quickly to consolidate the narrative. Richard was depicted as a tyrant. His Acts of Parliament were repealed. Titulus Radius, the document that had declared the princes illegitimate, was ordered destroyed. Parliament ordered that all copies be burned. One copy survived by chance, rediscovered centuries later. Its survival is how we know what it said.
So Henry ordered the destruction of the document that had removed the princes from the succession. The very document that, if genuine, might have suggested a reason why they were no longer needed.
Yes. Henry restored the prince's legitimacy posthumously, which allowed him to present himself as the rightful successor to their family's line. But this restoration also logically made them a greater threat to him than they had been to Richard. The contradiction at the centre of Tudor policy toward the princes has never been satisfactorily resolved by those who insist only Richard could have been responsible.
So the Tudor treatment of the story raises as many questions as it answers.
Yes, and the broader lesson is one that applies well beyond this case. History is not simply a record of what happened. It is a record of what those with the power to preserve records chose to include, what they chose to destroy, and what they chose to frame. Shakespeare's Richard III has shaped public understanding of this period more completely than any academic work. Not because it is accurate, but because it is unforgettable.
So a play written for Tudor audiences became the lens through which most people still see the 15th century.
Yes, this is the enduring power of narrative over evidence. Today, the Richard III Society, founded in 1924, continues to advocate for a more rigorous examination of the historical record and a reconsideration of the case against him. Serious historians remain divided. Some consider the circumstantial case against Richard to be overwhelming. Others argue that the evidence is too contaminated by Tudor interests to support any confident verdict.
So the debate continues at the highest levels of the discipline.
Yes, and the remains in Westminster Abbey continue to wait. Modern DNA analysis could potentially determine whether the remains are those of children related to the royal Plantagenet line. It could narrow the questions considerably, even if it cannot answer them all. The decision not to examine them is itself a choice made by living institutions about how much of the past they wish to disturb, and that choice, in a case about how power controls memory, is not without its own significance.
So the story of the princes in the tower is still being written by the decisions of those who hold the keys to it.
Yes, in history, silence is often the loudest evidence, and sometimes the only one that survives.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the silence, the shadow, and the unresolved question at the heart of one of England's darkest dynastic moments.
2 children entered a fortress and left no trace that history has been willing to follow. That unwillingness tells us as much about power as any document that survives.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time.